climate, making them ideal targets for impact. I also see cities as a place where so many systems, both physical and social, intersect and are in need of innovation to achieve a lot of the net zero strategies set out by local leaders who have seemed to adopt the mantra of climate neutrality. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by 3 leaders who are all innovating in different and important systems at play in their cities and are all advancing us towards the goal of climate neutrality in different ways. I'm a believer that our collective success is in part dependent on our willingness to believe that a more beautiful world is possible. And I'm hopeful that each of these panelists will get you to imagine the diverse pathways we can create to achieve this ambitious goal. So having said that, let's get to introductions. We'll first be hearing from John Mandyke, CEO of Urban Green Council. After capping a 25-year career as Chief Sustainability Officer for United Technologies Corporation, John joined Urban Green Council in 2018 as its first ever CEO. He is also a member of the New York City Department of Building Sustainability Board, a visiting scientist at the Harvard University School of Public Health, and an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut School of Business. John is also the founding chair of the Corporate Advisory Board for the World Green Building Council and co-author of the book Food Foolish.
Great,
Next,
Samantha, thanks for the introduction.
Oh yeah, of course. We're excited to hear from you today.
Okay.
Next, we'll be hearing from Matt Gonzer, who serves as Honolulu's Chief Resilience Officer and Executive Director of the city's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resilience. Prior to joining the office, he served for nearly 6 years as the Community Planning and Design Extension Agent with the University of Hawaii's Sea Grant College program. And his past experience also includes the development of the Oahu Resilience Strategy, which was adopted by City Council in October of 2019. He's currently leading the development of a climate adaptation strategy with the city called Climate Ready Oahu. And finally, we'll be hearing from Rachel James, who I'm also lucky enough to call a former colleague. Rachel and I briefly overlapped while I was at the Public Utilities Commission. But Rachel is a graduate of the William S. Richardson School of Law, where she earned certificates in environmental law and Native Hawaiian law. She currently serves as Commission Counsel with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, where she leads a number of proceedings on Hawaii's renewable energy transition. Rachel also wanted us to share that she is the mother of 2 dynamic girls and 1 furry feline. She enjoys camping, hiking, writing, reading, and learning about other cultures through travel and food. So I'm extremely excited to hear from each of these panelists today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to John to kick things off.
Great. Well, thank you, Samantha. I want to thank the AAA Honolulu for this great panel. I certainly want to thank Rachel and Matt for joining them with this panel. Let me just get my screen up. Here we go. Great. So I'm going to talk today about the experience from New York City, where I sit. Aloha from New York City, where the sun is setting, but certainly not, the sun is not setting on climate policy in New York. It's really just a brand new day. And I'd like to share with you the experience in New York from a decarbonization standpoint and what that can mean for the future of cities. First, I'll start out with just a little bit on my organization, Urban Green Council. We are an environmental nonprofit group. We serve as the Green Building Council of New York City. We've been around for 19 years. Our mission is to transform buildings for a sustainable future in New York City and around the world. What that means practically is we work on the carbon footprint reduction of buildings. We do that for New York City, but increasingly we see New York as an ideal laboratory for urban climate policy globally. And so what we do in New York, we actively share with our partners around the world, and vice versa. We actively import the best ideas to mold what we do here in New York. We do that in 4 ways at Urban Green. We convene to bring parties together to solve big problems. We do research. We have our own in-house data analysts that do research to either fill market gaps so the market can act, or to inform public policy. We do advocacy, and a lot of it, to influence the course of public policy when it comes to climate change and resiliency and sustainability. And we do training and education for architects, engineers, building trades, not only in New York, but actually in 57 cities across the US and Canada with training partners. Now, we do all of that because buildings matter, as everybody knows at this conference, and as Samantha already referenced. Globally, buildings consume 26% of the world's energy. In the United States, on average, buildings consume 40% of the world's energy. But in big cities like New York, buildings consume 78% of all the energy in New York City. And when this is a panel about decarbonization, so when you translate that to carbon, buildings emit nearly 70% of all the carbon in New York. And what I'll point out on this chart is that our number one source of carbon emissions in New York from all sources is gas and oil burned at buildings for heat and hot water. It represents 40% of all of our climate emissions. So that's a big issue for us from an electrification standpoint, and where we're going forward. And this is what is actually influencing the policies that I'll show you. We have a lot at stake in New York when it comes to climate change. We're a coastal city. New York has $3 trillion of insured coastal properties vulnerable to climate change. $3 trillion. That's twice the GDP of Canada. So we have a lot at stake. And climate change, unfortunately, is not theory in New York City. It's reality. New York Harbor is up 1 foot in the last century. Which means that coastal flooding is an issue for New York. You have a hurricane like Hurricane Sandy 9 years ago, come through, left a $20 billion bill because our sea levels are higher, disproportionately higher actually in this part of the United States than other places. And I only have to go back a few weeks to Hurricane Ida that hit New York at the beginning of September. This is a subway line I take pretty regularly, and it was a wall of water. Hurricane Ida really caught us off guard, by surprise, in the sense that it dumped 7 inches of rain in New York City in a very short period and left massive damage and deaths, unfortunately, from its very, very short but violent event in New York. And this is the climate reality. We're living in the climate future that was predicted just 10 years ago, with increasing storms and actually the severity of those storms. And this is a good example of that. So we have to find ways to reduce our carbon emissions. And we're on a pretty good path so far. Big buildings in New York have reduced their carbon emissions 23% over the last decade. This is a big finding from a research report we released just in December that covers here, and it's on our website. In New York, we're required to report building energy and water use every year. It's a law that Urban Green helped to pass 10 years ago. So we now have a full decade of data, and it's one of the most richest data sets in the world. We poured through that data to pull out the big trends, and we published them in this report. So here, this 23% reduction over the last 10 years gives us hope that we are on path to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050, which is the current policy goal. Now, this is a panel on decarbonization, so it's important to know what makes up this carbon reduction. The carbon reduction here, half of this reduction is coming from the greening of the grid, in the sense that newer fossil fuel plants, to be honest, came online, but are burning fuels at the electricity plant more efficiently. So that's half of the goodness here. The other half is investments done at the building. Half of that is for energy efficiency, and half of that is for fuel switching from oil to natural gas. So we're off to a good start from that standpoint. A few years ago, we formed one of our convenings that I talked about. It's called the 80 by 50 Buildings Partnership, where we brought together 70 experts from 42 organizations. We met 80 times over 8 months to come up with 21 consensus recommendations for how New York City buildings could be put on path to meet an 80% carbon reduction by 2050. We published our findings in something called the Blueprint for Efficiency, and then we delivered it here to our New York City Council, which was actually waiting for our convening. They were sending observers to get a jump start on the analysis and understanding for how New York City could manage its carbon emissions from its largest source. The City Council acted very quickly. We produced and delivered our report in September of that year. And by April, the landmark legislation known as Local Law 97 in New York City was passed. This law, when fully implemented by 2030, will lead to the largest carbon reduction of any city in the world. It's part of a broader bill called the Climate Mobilization Act. The feature of the bill is it sets annual carbon caps on buildings starting in 2024 and then strengthening in 2030. And then the legislation gives the authority to the Department of Buildings to set subsequent caps in 2035, 2040, 2045, and eventually 2050 to get to that 80% reduction. The law allows for flexible compliance mechanisms and options that Urban Green worked hard to get into the law. It has a different path for affordable housing and actually city government that I'll show you. And there's large fines for non-compliance. The fines are $268 per ton of carbon over the cap for each building. So there's a new price of carbon in New York City, and it's $268 a ton. And so this is how the law works. It covers buildings that are 25,000 square feet and greater. This was our recommendation. We have 1 million buildings in New York City. When you draw the line at 25,000 square feet and greater, you get to a population of 50,000 buildings. So that's the covered population. Those 50,000 buildings represent 60% of the floor area in the city and about half of all building emissions. And the single largest category in that covered populations is actually large multifamily housing. And so this is a law that covers both residential and commercial, and about 60-40 residential versus commercial are in that bucket. This is how the law works. It sets a carbon cap of kilograms of CO2 per square foot by 10 different building types. So there are 10 caps that fit 10 different building types. This is an example of 3 of the most popular ones. R2 is residential, Group B is offices, and Group R1, for example, these are in our building codes, are hotels. So you can see how the caps differ by just these 3 different occupancies. So in the residential area and the large multifamily housing, in 2024, 6.75 is the cap, that's kilograms of CO2 per square foot. And then you can see how that ramps down in 2030 to 4.07, and the same for offices and hotels. So we know what those caps are today. The subsequent caps to get you to 2050 will be determined by rulemaking as we get closer to those dates. So where are buildings today compared to those caps and compared to the progress that's already been made? You can see that by our analysis here, multifamily, which is the blue slide here, or blue part of the chart here, that today 21% of our multifamily housing are over the 2024 cap. That's about the same for hotel, which is in the orange. And then offices are about 11% over that. 11% of our offices are over that 2024 cap. So we've made good progress, more progress in the office front than the others, which is probably not a surprise or atypical for a large city. And so we have a lot of work to do in the multifamily area, and that's what we're about to do. Now, there are several ways you can comply for this law. The first, obviously, is you reduce carbon intensity. And you can do that through energy efficiency, which is your first best choice for how you reduce the carbon intensity of your building. You reduce the energy load so the power plant is using less. Or you switch to a lower carbon fuel. This gets to the electrification piece that we talked about, that if you're a residential building and you're using natural gas for heat and hot water, your best choice here is they're going to electrify and switch to a grid that becomes renewable over time. And by the way, our grid is very dirty in New York right now. It's 99% fossil fuel based. It used to be about 70, but we just closed a nuclear power plant that was providing fossil fuel free power. So we're now back to about 99%. We have tremendous plans over the next decade to green the grid. But ironically, what we found is if you electrify today, you still save carbon in a dirty grid because today's heat pump coefficients are much better than the boiler efficiencies that they're replacing. So that's the first way you can apply. Second way is the law allows for offsets and deductions. There's a 10% offset that's yet to be defined that we're still working through with the Department of Buildings to define how that would work. You can buy renewable energy credits, and two huge projects were just approved last week in New York to comply, to help our grid. And there's deductions for clean distributed energy as well. Or you pay the fine, which is up to $268 a ton. For several of our large office buildings that I've looked at, we're talking about annual fines in the $2, $3, $4, $5 million a year range. And so that's a big stick to encourage the carbon efficiencies and reductions that we need. Now, there's two others that we're actually working on that are real time, haven't been passed, but we're encouraging they be discussed, which is first carbon trading between buildings. And I'm happy to get into that into the question, but we think this is a unique global opportunity to unlock a new policy tool for cities, which is carbon trading between buildings. And the other is we're advocating that instead of paying a fine, if owners can't comply, they would pay into a fund that would finance energy efficiency and affordable housing. So that's another area we're working on. Those caps apply to the majority of buildings. There are other compliance pathways for units, buildings with affordable housing or rent stabilized or low income housing and houses of worship. Those categories aren't subject to the capped, but they're not exempt. They have to do a checklist of energy efficiency measures that by design are lower costs than what the cap would be, so that those costs aren't passed on to the tenants and exacerbate the cost of housing in a large city like New York. And so there's a prescriptive path, this checklist path for houses of worship and rent stabilized or low income housing. And then for city buildings, which represent the largest footprint actually of any single owner in New York, the city is holding itself accountable to a tighter reduction, 40% by 2025 and 50% by 2030 versus the 40% by 2030 that the law calls for all other buildings. So that's our story in New York. I would just make mention of one other item that is late breaking is that the city is contemplating a ban on fossil fuels in new construction. Legislation was introduced earlier this year for that. It looks like we'll probably see some legislative action on that this fall. We don't know where it'll be going, but we're actively engaged right now. But it's just another example of where carbon policies are going. And I'll be happy to get into a discussion on those implications during the Q&A if anybody likes. But with Samantha, that wraps up my talk. All of our information is published here at urbangreencouncil.org. So please take a look and please follow us on our social media channels if you want to stay up to date on the work and the activities here in the Big Apple.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. I didn't realize how much inspiring work was being done in New York. I'm actually from New York State. And so to learn more about what they're doing on the energy and energy efficiency side is very new to me. Something that stuck out that I just wanted to raise before we jump into our next panelist, Matt, is you mentioned carbon trading for buildings, and I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how that would work. I mean, carbon trading is not a new concept, but to be used on the city level is different. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Samantha, you're absolutely right. Carbon trading is not new, but as a city level policy tool for buildings, it's actually pretty revolutionary. We did a global convening on this and published a report that provides for 59 policy options for any city in the world to consider for carbon trading for buildings. And we learned from the only city that has started, which is Tokyo, which is kind of in its infancy in the program, but we met a great deal with the Tokyo folks to understand how a program like that could be scaled for a city like New York. The idea in New York is we have these carbon caps on buildings. The carbon cap is a great tool in the sense that it's easy to understand, but it's actually a pretty blunt instrument because it doesn't understand what's going on in the building. So we have some headwinds that we're trying to overcome. One of them is density. Density should be your friend for sustainability. It's not under this law with a carbon cap, because a building could use energy very, very efficiently. But we have office buildings in New York City when, pre-COVID times that have 10,000 people in them. You just can't get around the fact that that building is just going to use a lot of energy because there's a lot of people in them. Same thing with residential, like particularly in lower income. There are more people per square foot in residential. And so that type of density just means there's more people, means there's more energy, there's more hot water needed, there's more heating, there's more cooling needed. The cap is blind to that. And so you could have a building with very low density that gets under the cap, and you could have a building with very high density that could be the exact same square footage that is over the cap. So we need to find flexible compliance mechanisms. And the idea is if a building can get below its cap, it ought to be able to sell the excess savings to a building that can't. Otherwise, the only kind of real option left is for the building that can't comply is to pay a fine. And we believe that's a failure because we don't get the carbon savings we need. Instead of paying a fine, I'd rather pay somebody else to go an extra mile to get below the cap, because that building could be in a different capital cycle. It could be reskinning its building. It could have way different ways to get way below the cap. It has no incentive to do so. So that's the idea of how carbon trading could work. And we're working with the mayor's office in the city right now in a study to try to analyze, can we make that feasible for New York?
So fascinating. I'm excited to see the evolution of that in New York. So thank you so much, John. Let's switch over to Matt Gonzer with the city. Matt, take it away.
Great, thank you, Sam and John. Really appreciate that background and context. A lot to learn from a jurisdiction like New York City, and it's really helpful to always have municipal leaders out there doing the work, because frankly, leadership is sort of emboldened or gets courage when there's an example that we can point to. I really appreciated Samantha's discussions about mantras and how do we manifest that. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here at the city, all in partnership with you. And maybe to start off with a joke, a planner walks into an architecture and design symposium and says, we need better buildings. That's it, that's my whole joke. So, we at the city, we're trying to really bring some collective efforts forward in a rational way. And one of those ways was to develop these things around strategies, specific actions, but being transparent and open and always tracking and measuring our progress or lack thereof. And that's really what I think we're all here collectively talking about, having that notion of a journey towards a carbon neutral city really requires, presenting that North Star and what is that end destination, and then navigating and course correcting all along the way. And you all have at different points in time, either through the development of the office in the 2016 election or participating in the resilience strategy over the past 3 to 4 years, and then most recently focusing in explicitly on climate action through the Climate Action Plan. And for your general awareness, we now ensure that we are tracking progress and reporting that information out in the city's annual sustainability report, which really was only the third one in around Earth Day of this year. So very quickly, having the goals is great. Sometimes you need the triggers, and John spoke a lot about the different ordinances and the development of that, and how do you tweak and refine those over time with that equity mindset, recognizing that sometimes the hammer can hit really hard and you're not just trying to get compliance, but you're trying to facilitate and manage change all towards these goals that frankly we need yesterday in terms of reducing and eliminating our contributions to global climate change, because they're just making it that much harder to ensure prosperity and and thriving, healthy communities into the future. So functionally, what are we talking about here? At the end of last year, City Council passed and then Mayor signed into law that the city must develop a climate action plan with this end date in lockstep with the state's law, which is 100% clean energy and net negative carbon economy by 2045. And this is also in line with City Council's commitment, reaffirming our participation in the Global Paris Climate Agreement, which we should all feel very pleased and much more comfortable that the US is fully back in, and we are all in because there's no shortage of need to act on this work. And just a quick note around COVID, I'll show very quickly what our makeup is in terms of where our greenhouse gas pollution comes from. And we don't yet have the data for last year. There's a lag in what we're able to process. But really, COVID has reminded us of our shared fate as we all think about the capacity and speed with which we're capable of making bold decisions and reacting in an emergency. The climate crisis is an emergency, and there are so many parallels between our current economic and health issues and what we anticipate to be real challenges in the future if we don't take this bold leadership, which is necessary to invest in climate action now, rather than waiting and paying dividends in the future and needing to think about economic recovery. So very quickly, just to orient you to the sustainability report, you can see some of the main areas that we report out on and track and measure. We're going to be talking a little bit about sustainable city operations. Certainly, we need to walk the walk as well, but also thinking sort of collectively in that climate action section. And in the report, you can see a whole variety of graphs and figures. Here's one demonstrating that, really informed and facilitated by the state's leadership through the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative. We have seen reductions in emissions since the early 2000s, and primarily that's focused on improvements in the grid, but also building efficiency. We certainly need to think about new buildings, but really thinking about the existing building stock is essential. And if our buildings are that much more efficient, we don't need to produce as much power moving forward, which we know is presenting some conflicts and equity issues all around this island as well as the state. And while we were stagnant for a couple of years there unfortunately has been an uptick in the past couple of years, primarily driven by growth in the transportation sector and primarily aviation, which has grave implications for how we think about recovery, how we think about our local economy driven by the visitor industry. And here's that pie, our emissions pie, not as high as a place like New York City, which has a lot of efficiencies in its transportation network. So our, as I mentioned, ground transportation and aviation are really significant portions of our emissions locally, but buildings make up and account for, or at least the energy used within buildings, accounting for around 35% of our emissions. And John spoke a lot about the grid too. We're fortunate and excited to continue to see improvements across our electricity sector, primarily driven by rooftop solar and distributed solar, which unfortunately hasn't really gotten to those that perhaps could benefit from it the most. So we need to make sure that we continue to advance those programs to allow people to tap into it over time. But this combination of greening the grid and building efficiencies, both through retrofits and new construction, really is one of our main mechanisms towards a carbon neutral society and city. And then lastly, just to key in on what the city is up to, we'll have a lot more exciting information to share out hopefully in the next couple of weeks around some of our partnership programs and energy savings performance contracts, both looking at efficiency within the buildings, but more on-site renewable generation. So I anticipate when we get into the 2021 and 2022 columns on this kind of a graphic, we'll see really great improvements in our electricity consumption, but also our on-site generation. Taking us quickly back to the climate action plan, though we're here to talk about buildings and energy today, we'd be remiss if we didn't highlight that it really, in this first plan, keys in on these three main emission sectors and the areas that the city has the most direct influence over. And that includes transportation and land use, buildings and energy, as I mentioned, and then also waste management, both solid waste and wastewater. But plans are one thing, and Mayor, when he released the Climate Action Plan on Earth Day of this year, reminded us of that. You know, it's all well and good to have these plans, but it's how we react and what we do in the days and weeks ahead that is really important about driving that action and executing on our commitments and the mantras that Sam alluded to at the start. Pleased to say that climate action is already underway, and frankly, it's just good business. When we can be more efficient in our facilities and operations, that's cost savings. Same goes for the city as it does for private enterprise as well. So we're doing a lot around the transportation sectors, a lot of movement around electrifying our bus fleet as well as our city motor pool. We have, bringing those kinds of improvements to community island line through complete streets or more efficient transportation like the bus only lane on King Street. And then also even looking at parking reforms to make sure that we are not over obligating people to build things that aren't necessarily needed by the market and that make things more expensive for those that are trying to get into housing. And then on buildings and energy, I alluded to a couple of energy performance savings contracts that we have underway, and then tracking and measuring our use of energy over time, looking at our permitting processes to streamline clean energy projects, and then updating energy codes progressively with advanced provisions. That was most recently done summer of last year. So again, now looking and kind of wrapping up this discussion around buildings and energy, we're really talking about two things, right? John spoke about it quite a bit. We have existing building stock, but we also know new things are going to get built. I'm not going to speak really to that new construction side. Really exciting to see the other panelists and presentations for the rest of today and into tomorrow. And you're all more expert at speaking to those subjects anyway. What I want to leave us with here today is how do we facilitate and allow the market to even advance the transitions that we're talking about here? And how do we set up the systems to make it easy to understand where we're at in terms of our usage, and then use that information to support clean energy jobs, but also savings to tenants and et cetera. So, what is benchmarking? And John didn't use that word, I don't believe, but he was in essence talking about that. That 10 years of data and information that they have is critical because it really helps you drive where to think about where you need to bring more resources to bear, support this transition, and really key in on the equity components of programs to facilitate upgrades and improvements. So definitely, City Council has weighed in terms of new buildings and efficiencies moving forward. But what we're talking about with energy or building benchmarking, both energy and water, is shining a light on the existing use within the buildings. And benchmarking itself is a pretty simple concept. We can't manage what we don't measure. No one would embark on buying a car if you didn't know its fuel efficiency. You're probably looking at appliances and how they operate and run. We just don't generally have that information for tenants, lessees, or building operators across the board. And one way to facilitate empowerment is to gather that information, provide it back out, because it then enables tenants, buyers, and users to get to know what type of energy and water is used in the building so that they can make better informed decisions and frankly, all move us towards lower energy use and lower energy bills while driving climate action. As I mentioned, about 35% of our greenhouse gas emissions here on island come from electricity used in buildings. And in some early polling towards the Climate Action Plan, people generally understood that there's a lot of benefit that can come from an awareness of the usage of utilities. And there was generally at that point in time, pre-COVID, overwhelming support on this notion of benchmarking. But even more so now, I think as people generally understand the economic burdens that high electricity rates pose for small businesses, offices, et cetera, we see a lot of great opportunity in this concept moving forward. And we had done some preliminary investigation when the climate action plan was being developed. And generally what we're talking about here in terms of some intended outcomes are really lower operating expenses, driving economic growth, and reducing climate change. And benchmarking is really just about providing that information. Building owners of a certain type and size can enter their information into a portal. We can access and, to John's point, slice and dice all that information. It's a basic reporting tool that is shared and reported to the city, but it's really about using that information to spur the market to capitalize on existing programs that exist out there, say it's through Hawaii Energy or others, so that we can be more targeted in our outreach in supporting those that are interested in taking that next step to act upon their own information and bring down their own expenses. And benchmarking is by no means new. You can see from the map here across different cities and states, different levels of what they are doing in terms of their building benchmarking, some going as far as simultaneously establishing building performance standards that would kick in at a certain date. But we're looking at how this is being applied in other jurisdictions, learning from their pain points and lessons, and trying to think about how to bring such a resource here to Honolulu. But also already there are a lot of buildings out there that are reporting their energy usage and water usage. As I mentioned, we are underway through some of our efficiency improvements to benchmark city facilities. This was part of the ordinance that was passed at the end of last year. There are a lot of other large buildings on Oahu that go through and utilize the EPA's portfolio manager, similarly taking that next step to then ultimately become Energy Star certified, which supports, again, tenants, but also in communicating out the story of that operation. And then the state has done a lot, certainly in all of their efforts across the UH facilities, using that information to inform how they improve their operations. And very quickly, a snapshot. I don't want to pause on this too long, but needless to say, there are examples of how passing benchmarking and transparency policy have resulted in significant improvements in jurisdictions around the nation in terms of driving down energy consumption, saving money, and spurring some of that economic growth, which we know is really essential currently and moving forward as we try to bounce forward from the COVID economic shock. And not only these benefits at the community-wide level, when you really get into it and looking at this whole arena of a sector, we're reducing energy waste and expense, providing market competition and consumer choice, and really supporting industry to take action. The benchmarking in and of itself doesn't necessarily mandate anyone to take action, but again, it's really about empowering with information so that we as the city know how we can best connect with those that are interested in finding support, or others can simply act upon their own information to reinvest in their physical plant. And really, savings can start today. I think everyone recognizes the challenges to operations all around this island, whether you're an office building that hasn't had a lot of occupancy the past year, your small business just trying to navigate and stay afloat. We've been pouring so much federal resources into just paying back utility bills. And certainly that's essential. But if there are ways to drive down that cost over time and then ensure that any operations or buildings themselves are that much more resilient, heaven forbid, we have some other economic crisis in the future, that's really important. And both the utility and our public benefit partners at Hawaii Energy are super keen on empowering with this information so that we can support people to make that transition. And again, climate action can be good business. Really, the primary motivation for this should just be savings, and then also recognizing that it allows us to sync climate action for our future and success. So with that, I'll pause here and hand it back to you, Samantha.
Thanks so much, Matthew. I really appreciate you sharing all the great work the city's been up to these days. It's very exciting when I moved to Hawaii about 7 years ago, I was really interested in pushing sustainability at the local level, and these conversations were just beginning. So to now see the number of initiatives that are currently underway makes me feel like my woo-woo idea of adopting mantras to climate neutrality and deep decarbonization aren't too far off. I just wanted to circle back on something that you raised during your presentation. You briefly mentioned that city building, you talked a little bit about the city building efficiencies and benchmarking. Just to add another joke, I frequent energy Twitter, and there was a poll that asked if your pet could be an energy technology, which would it be? And I said that my cat would be energy efficiency because it's just always there. She's always around. And I think that that is something very similar that we tend to overlook, that energy efficiency is a low-hanging fruit, a low-hanging resource that is always there and we can be taking more advantage of. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how adopting benchmarking and energy efficiency will improve the city's facilities and operations specifically.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question, Samantha. So I don't want to steal the spotlight. I would just ask that people stay tuned in the coming weeks for some announcements about how we actually are accelerating that. But I can share also, looking ahead, next Wednesday, the first Wednesday of every October, is Energy Efficiency Day. So everyone bring your cats out and celebrate with Sam. But the city, when we launched an energy savings performance contract, Hawaii Energy as a partner was there right away. They cut us a big check recognizing the improvements that we're doing. And then in addition to this model that allows us to capitalize on the speed and the sort of openness of the private industry and their ability to look at and navigate across all of our facilities, we're now able to use their capital to make things happen that much faster, pay them off with the savings over time. And because all of the work will actually bring really significant savings, not only are we able to pay them through a different capital mechanism, we're actually going to recoup several $1 million annually just through those savings on top of what we have to pay back to the ESCO companies. So again, I don't want to steal the spotlight. We do actually have some exciting news coming out in the middle of this month, or sorry, I should say middle of October, as well as the end of October on a second contract that we're excited to get underway as well.
Great, awesome. Well, we look forward to that. Appreciate the presentation, and we'll hear more from you in our Q&A session. But for now, we're going to shift gears and transition over to Rachel James. Rachel, take it away.
Thanks so much, Samantha. I appreciate your welcome. And thank you everyone for welcoming my thoughts and my presence here at the conference today. I really love all this conversation about cats because it doesn't make me feel so bad about sharing with you all that I have a cat and kids, in addition to being an attorney at the Public Utilities Commission. So today, my conversation about exploring the role of equity in carbon neutral climate solutions. Before I get deeply into that, I do have to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. Do the attorney thing. It's a real thing. My thoughts are my own. And while I do work for the Public Utilities Commission and some of the things I share may be informed by that work, my thoughts are actually just reflective of the things I've experienced and shouldn't be construed to be a position of the Public Utilities Commission. So with that underway, we will jump right into the content of today's discussion. Today's topics, I'd like to hopefully cover three things, and the role of equity in climate solutions specifically, wanting to talk about how it's important to identify the harm. Secondly, I'd like to share that climate solutions are essentially people solutions. And finally, discussing effective systems and how they support thriving communities, what that looks, tastes, feels, and smells like. So when we think about equity, sometimes I hear the phrase centering equity. I've heard that more often, but sometimes we think like, what does that really mean to center something? And is this necessary in the development of carbon neutral cities? I'd say yes, because equity requires that we look at the deficit or the harm in order to conceptualize the most appropriate compensation or remedy. Centering equity is critical. And as a practical matter, and to help develop a framework of thought, the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative offers that equity not only be embedded into programming, but that equity is also intentionally applied to the structure, culture, and operational practices of the organizations involved. In order to be truly effective, this equity work should include all stakeholder groups, program staff, community members, administrators, boards, and funders. If you think about it, that's kind of a lot of people. And you might ask, well, is that really necessary? Does that mean that we have to plan with everyone in mind, in addition to planning for environmental considerations? Well, yes and no. And as we think about who indeed will survive in the face of climate change and what their future might be like, I'd offer that we consider Sam's introductory conversation, where she referenced the UN report that cities consume 78% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. If they account for less than 2% of the Earth's surface, and some of those top polluters in cities, transportation and energy production. So a geographically small portion of the Earth is driving impacts all across the globe. But don't get overwhelmed. The globe is huge, but let's think a little more granularly. And instead of asking who will survive generally, perhaps the question for us is who will survive in America, where according to the Brookings Institute, over the past 40 years, the country has experienced sharp increases in urban poverty. The number of metropolitan neighborhoods in which 30% or more of residents live in poverty doubled between 1980 and 2010. Encouraging us to zoom in on this focus is by no means my advocacy to ignore global problems. If anything, it's my encouragement to think globally and act locally, to look into our own front and backyards and ask who indeed will survive the floods, droughts, hurricanes, fires, heavy rains, snow and ice storms, and all other manner of natural disasters incited by climate change. So this image is from Bloomberg City Lab, an article in 2016 entitled "Half the World Lives in 1% of its Land. The People of Earth Really Love Their Cities." It was an article written by Tanvi Misra. And this map depicts that half the people in the world cram into just 1% of the Earth's surface. That's depicted in yellow. And then the other half sprawl across the remaining 99%, depicted in black. I think this image clearly shows urban sprawl. And urban sprawl is a very common type of development in the United States, and many other countries for that matter around the world. And it's often criticized for its numerous negative effects on the environment, social life, and the economies of cities and the countries they reside in. Despite these dire statistics about cities, there's still hope. As we just saw and heard from our previous presenters, John and Matt, half the world's population lives in cities, and this is actually likely to increase to over 2/3 by 2030. But changing how we plan, build, manage, and power our cities and towns so that we greatly reduce our per capita carbon footprint is key to achieving equitable outcomes. There's an organization, C40, which many of you may have heard of, and it's a network of the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. And this organization believes that cities are vulnerable, but they're also powerful, and that cities can actually be the solution to climate change, largely because you have city mayors who are directly accountable to their constituents. And they're more nimble than state and national elected officials to take decisive action, and often with immediate and impactful results. So what our cities do individually and in unison can help address climate change and can set an agenda for cities and governments everywhere. In carbon neutral cities, my kind of depiction of what that approach has been is that they took a really big problem or a really big harm, like climate change, and sought to provide a remedy through small solutions that are meant to give big impacts in places with small geographic footprints. And that makes sense, right? Now, at this local level, we have opportunity to do the same, take big issues like historic and persisting harms and how they affect individuals, and look at what we can be doing to remedy those harms through equity-based solutions. Again, when centering equity, we must identify the harm. And as big and as horrible as that might be, it's important to be specific, to keep in mind that the past, in many cases and for many people, is actually still present. We deal daily with decisions that were made well before we started our projects or our jobs. But if we commit to an equity-centered shift, the detriment of those decisions don't have to be a part of our future. A helpful thought framework that I like to use is thinking of surviving versus thriving. Surviving, I think of it as continuing to live or exist, where thriving can be defined as growing or developing well, or to prosper or to flourish. Surviving is a grim struggle. You're white knuckling life, you're just barely getting by, and thriving is living and thinking abundantly. Surviving can be a drag, a daily slog to stay alive, but thriving is joyful and infectious. These are some of the ideas that author and Dr. Anna Akbari presented in an article she wrote in Psychology Today. which are helpful to keep in mind as we think about kind of the two ways that people exist in cities, as well as other places around the world. But centering equity and investigating the difference between surviving and thriving demands that we consider more consistently the reality of other people's existence, a point that the authors of this paper depicted here highlighted in their abstract by stating that natural disasters of 2017 to 2019 have exposed weaknesses in our preparation for disaster and climate change. What if we had paid attention before disaster ensued to how environmental protection and planning can prevent and minimize the harm that disasters cause to people, their housing, and the infrastructure of our cities, states, and territories? This paper explores how such changes in various federal and state laws can make us more resilient, again, focusing on this surviving versus thriving component. And as we focus on surviving and thriving and understanding the difference and recognizing the shift that we want to make from one to the other, identifying the harm will require we take an honest look back in time and an assessment of if and how you or your organization contributed to the harm. Does this mean that you have to atone for wrongs done that you didn't actually commit? Not exactly, but it's important to identify them so that you can make sure you're not perpetuating or exacerbating them. The transition to renewable energy is actually a good example of clean intentions that, if done in the absence of equity considerations, can result in sustaining the status quo. This concern is front and center in the energy justice movement, which evolved from, and in many cases, is synonymous with both environmental and climate justice movements. The Initiative for Energy Justice defines energy justice as having the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens on marginalized communities. This is talking about policy inequities and wealth deprivation, and that's really plainly seen in a practice called redlining, which many of you may be familiar with. Redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. So redlining made it hard for residents to get loans from homeownership or maintenance, and it led to cycles of disinvestment. The history isn't behind us though, and we can see that reflected in 87% of San Francisco's redline neighborhoods being low-income neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification today. And gentrification is a displacement of people. And when we think about displacing people, we have to think about how huge a contributor displacement is to cultural erasure, especially if that group of people's culture is largely rooted in place. Of particular importance in a land-restricted place like Hawaii is the consideration of what communities house society's resources. Does the greater good justify the harm a marginalized community endures? Now, I know that particularly here, this image could introduce a sense of division and push you to think about which side of the Mauna Kea issue you're on. I encourage you to save that thought exercise for another time, and to instead allow this picture to help you pause to consider generally the challenge of placing resources for the greater good and how the placement impacts the communities nearest to it, as well as those who have historically been present. While justice movements have various identifying terms, civil rights, social justice, energy, environmental, and climate justice, these movements have consistently asked decision makers to think about the harm their decisions create and perpetuate. Again, when we lead with centering equity, doing so requires that we identify the harm. That means planners, designers, builders, policymakers have to look closely at the way we are planning and for whom. We have to ask questions like, who is the most vulnerable in your community? And what specifically are their vulnerabilities? Which leads me to my second point. Climate solutions are really people solutions. How do we, in our respective responsibilities, get to those solutions? Well, we just ask. What do people on the ground want to see? Sometimes asking is asking permission. Asking who you are in this landscape and what your responsibility is. Asking what does the community need? Even in your inquiry though, make sure that your questions are grounded not in what you think you need to know, but what is needed in the area of concern and by the people in that area, both historically and for those who are there presently. Remember, if you're designing something totally new, you're dealing with existing environments and existing constructs and social norms, as well as societal norms. And you're dealing with existing inequities. So commit to not exacerbating those. Even before you get to the stage of cultural consultation, just ask yourself about the place. I use these images from the Pew Research Center in a 2015 article entitled "After 200 Years, Native Hawaiians Make a Comeback." It's written by Sarah Kehalani-Gu. She references an innovative technique that estimates that there were about 683,000 Native Hawaiians on the island in 1778, when British explorer Captain James Cook arrived. Now while that number is on the higher range of the highly disputed historical estimates, which have ranged from as low as 200,000 to as high as 1 million, historians and demographers agree that the devastation of the population was swift and dramatic. Sarah Gu's article focuses on David Swanson's estimates, which indicate that 1 in 17 Native Hawaiians had died within 2 years of Cook's arrival. By 1800, the population had declined by 48% since Cook set foot on Hawaii. And by 1820, it had declined 71%. By 1840, the population had declined by 84%. So even though this article is about a turnaround story, I use it as an example to articulate what you see when you actually turn around and look historically what's happened. And consider that history and understanding how that history informs the lives of the people who are here today. And as you think about people solutions to carbon emissions caused climate problems, consider that need may be differently conceived by different people. In the global West, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a common reference used to readily identify a particular depiction of the basic needs of humans. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the image on your left. The image on the right, however, is one that was created by Dr. Cindy Blackstop to help explain the different emphases of the Western worldview and the views of First Nations. We see something that's a bit more individualistic on the Western perspective and something that's a bit more long-term and comprehensive and community focused in terms of First Nations perspectives. So we've got history in place, culturally based views, and now we have to consider what is accessible and affordable. Often we conceive affordable as accessible, but we know the systemic injustices have kept even affordable solutions out of reach of some of those who are in the most need. We see this largely pronounced in access to healthful food and healthcare. Despite having food production that can feed our nation multiple times over, there are many who struggle daily with food security, despite the myriad programs meant to ensure affordability of quality food. In terms of accessible and affordable, a question you can ask yourself and your organization is, does the project impede or empower the residents or the users of your project? When we think of buildings and how we build or retrofit, we can think of energy. Recall, its generation, energy generation, is a primary driver of a city's carbon emissions. So to me, green energy buildings, or rather GEBs, which is grid interactive efficient buildings, are a way to start with what you've got. Make it the best it can be while you plan for improvements, especially when you think about improvements. So let's not forget to ask, do the improvements here negatively impact a neighboring community? When I think about neighbors, I can't help think about sharing food and how doing so can be such a wonderful introduction to meaningful dialogue. When I think of food and thriving and people solutions that carbon neutral cities can provide, I think of, what does a thriving food system look like? Well, I think we don't actually have to look far, as I'm certain many of you are familiar with the Ahupua'a land management system that existed across the islands in Hawaii. Here are some characteristics of that land management system specifically related to food systems and how that has changed over time. This is critical to keep in mind in a location that is land restricted and that imports 85 to 90% of its food. When we are thinking of natural carbon sinks and trees as a component of a carbon neutral city, are we also thinking of if and how the selection of flora is informed by historical practices to address present needs? My goal here is not to inundate you with tasks and asks, but more to suggest some approaches and considerations to keep in mind as you boldly embrace the challenge presented to us by climate change and the solution that cities, and carbon neutral cities specifically, can provide. The long and short of things is that people, like onions, have layers, and so should our people solutions to climate change. I hope the following clip here, Shrek is a movie that I enjoy watching with my kiddos. So I hope this helps illustrate the point, and that you keep this joyfully in mind when you do your work to center equity, because sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Again, what do thriving communities look, taste, feel, and smell like in the face of climate change and historic harms, as well as systemic injustice? Well, I'd venture to say that they don't taste like onions, or perhaps they do, and maybe some garlic and some peppers and many other things. But more seriously, as I noted before, ask those communities. There are a number of organizations and communities around the world doing really amazing work to contribute to the wholesomeness of their neighbors and friends. This last section is just a quick introduction to a few of them to give you a sense of how different organizations are focusing on people solutions, Perhaps one or more of them will be future collaborators for you. So communities, again, know themselves best. You can inquire about their core values, what matters most to them, and what solutions look like for them. This organization, Huio Kuapa, was founded in 1989 and educates local and global communities about Native Hawaiian biocultural resource management through the restoration, use, and maintenance of Molokai loko'ia, which are traditional Hawaiian fish ponds and their adjacent land. Now, while we think of cities, you don't generally think of Molokai for those who are familiar with the islands, but I think we can learn things from even our rural places that can contribute to the development of our cities. Another organization, Oahu Energy Cooperative, is in Molokai as well, and it was born out of a grassroots community effort to shape Molokai's energy future through community developed and owned renewable energy projects. Their mission is to produce locally owned, affordable renewable energy for the benefit of their members, the community, and the environment. An organization that's actually funded both of the previous groups that I mentioned is Hawaii People's Fund, whose mission is to support, fund, and amplify the work of Hawaii-based grassroots organizations. Specifically, Hawaii People's Fund funds organizations that are challenging systems of oppression through a unique intersectional approach to social change. And on this slide, there's just a depiction of the number of organizations that were granted this year and their location throughout the state. Really excited to lift up Hawaii Energy as a local gem and really glad to hear them mentioned in previous presentations. And they have a number of programs, and the one listed here on the slide is just an example of them working with local folks for local solutions and savings. Their grid interactive efficient building efforts are currently underway, and I'm encouraged by the resources they are making available. Outside of Hawaii, states like California in their Public Utilities Commission they're investing in equity efforts with their environmental and social justice action plans. I'll note just a few things here on the slide that California's action plan focuses on areas like increasing climate resilience in environmental and social justice communities, as well as increasing investment in clean energy resources to those same communities. Finally, local leadership and future planning, I believe, is embodied by the Aloha Aina Economic Futures Initiative, which has comprised a 4-part community engagement process that produced a value statement, an action agenda, a project assessment tool, and now a policy playbook. Cities house so much, so the approach to making them resilient, carbon neutral, and above all, livable will require that more professions adopt an equity-centered approach. Climate change is doing enough harm. We don't need to contribute to more harm with poor planning. Remember, you have a professional responsibility, but also human responsibility. So how do we plan better? We center equity. We plan for people solutions, and we commit to developing spaces in which the most disadvantaged and marginalized are enabled to thrive and not just survive. Thank you so much for welcoming me to share. Samantha, I welcome you to take the floor.
Rachel? Sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties. I don't know if this was right on time or if I kind of blipped out for a second, but apologies. Really, really great. I did catch most of your presentation, so I just wanted to appreciate the perspective that you brought to today's conversation and the work that you're doing in this sector, as this aspect of energy and climate, I think, has, as you mentioned, been overlooked for far too long. And the transition that we're in right now presents a really unique opportunity to investigate what's the best way on how to lift up communities of color and low-income communities that have been historically burdened by energy pollution and environmental issues across the world. And what stuck for me in your presentation was really the need to ask. I've done some research in the energy equity space, and one of the things that a good friend of mine once told me was that don't overlook equity in the favor of urgency. And it feels appropriate considering the moment or the defining moment that's before us, and how a lot of the scientific community is really stressing the need to act urgently. And I feel like there can be a tendency to overlook this aspect of the transition because of that. And I think it's important to, as you mentioned, center it in the conversations that we have going forward. it really I think asking really underpins the energy and climate justice movement just by creating the space for communities to be heard in the policies and programs that are shaping the energy and climate future. So really appreciative of that perspective. Before moving into our Q&A session, I just had a couple of questions for you. We're a little ahead of schedule, so indulge me for a minute. You know, equity is becoming a component of many conversations in different sectors, and I think everybody has a different or unique way of interpreting or applying it. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to the dimensions of equity and how the audience could better conceptualize the application of equity in their work.
Sure. I appreciate your affirming comments, Samantha, so thank you. And I think framing is important. And in equity work, you'll hear some things pretty consistently. You'll hear concepts about recognition, procedure, and distribution. And so in terms of procedure, making sure that marginalized communities are included in the decision-making process and meaningfully engaged. And so that's kind of at the point that a suggested decision is being considered, as opposed to when a decision is made and then seeking buy-in for that decision. In terms of recognition, that's accounting for stakeholder knowledge. And so understanding that perhaps you as an expert, while you may have a deep understanding of the project and why it's reasonable, in seeking input from a community, you don't necessarily need them to be experts like you, but recognizing where they're coming from, some of the things that may be important to them, and allowing that to be just as important as your technical expertise. And then another kind of dimension of equity is considering the distribution, both of cost and benefits. Particularly in energy, one of the things that we've seen historically is that energy projects are sited in communities who don't necessarily immediately receive the benefits, but they often receive the burdens. And so we think about that often in environmental justice in places like Cancer Alley, where their residents in the community have a high percentage of cancers relative to or related to the energy power plants that are located in close proximity to them. And then so we can think of these three components and then kind of wrap them in a fourth component, which is just to remember context, which I spoke a little bit about in understanding historically what's happened in a place, but then thinking about the people that are here currently and how that history informs their present experience.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, your ending point leads really nicely into my next question about meeting communities where they are. So you just touched on how important it is to meet a community where they are in this transition and apply context. Context really is everything. And so noting that this could be a challenging lift, can you share some ways organizations can successfully and productively engage with communities on the ground that are maybe a little hesitant or resistant to moving an agenda forward or participating in the transition?
Yeah, I think one of the things that can be helpful, and I touched on it a little bit, is just when you're asking, again, you're not the ask isn't necessarily what can I do to get you to agree to this thing that I'm saying needs to be done, but really to ask what a community's needs are, what their interests are, and what's important to them, and allow that to inform the process that you are like applying your expertise to. And I think in terms of working with communities, because we use that term like community, and sometimes it's hard to figure out like who exactly are we talking about. But there's a number of organizations that are serving community needs in a lot of different ways. And Hawaii actually has a ton of nonprofit organizations, and we have the benefit of technology. So sometimes it's just quickly doing a Google search, seeing who's in your area, and calling them up and saying like, hey, you know, you're in an area that I'm concerned about, and I'm curious what are the things that are important to your community. So sometimes it's starting the conversation early just to get to know one another and to get to know the community, as opposed to like figuring out how do you get to the thing that you need to know to make sure your project is successful.
Yeah, no, that's good perspective. It's good insight. It's actually one of the things I really love about Hawaii and the communities here. It's, you know, not shy to be vocal. And I think that that's so critical in so many sectors, but particularly in the climate transition movement. Well, thank you so much. Recognizing we have about 20 minutes left for question and answers. I'm going to switch over to some of the questions that came in from the audience. But before I do so, I was informed that the poll that I referenced at the beginning of the panel did not go live. So we're gonna issue that poll now, so all of you can have a chance to participate in what a carbon neutral city means to you. So just take a second and then we'll jump into Q&A. Okay, so we have a bunch of really great questions here. I'm going to start with John, considering you were our first panelist. So we'll just circle it back to you. And one of the first questions we have from the audience is, how are you measuring the emissions for each building in New York City? Is there a comprehensive system that is collecting data for every building? Can you speak to the tools that you're using to measure the emissions?
Sure, and it echoes exactly what Matt was talking about. It's benchmarking. And so the primary data for doing the analysis to lead up to this legislation and the compliance mechanism is the required filing by the building to the city every year on its energy and water use. And so, it speaks to why benchmarking is so powerful in the sense of, as Matt had mentioned, all the reasons why you want to do it up front, from awareness setting and, knowing what you're measuring so you can get to where you're going. But since we've been doing it for 10 years in New York, it has been in anticipation of a law like this. And so it takes on a greater importance from a compliance standpoint and from a data efficacy standpoint.
Okay, apologies if I'm jumping around, but I'm trying to bucket the questions so that they're related to one another. And actually, there's one here for you, Matt, that's related to the benchmarking and efficiency conversation. Someone's interested in how granular is the data that's being collected on emissions and energy performance in the city and county. How is that currently being, or how granular is that data now?
Yeah, so the way to access the information is directly from the utility. In this case, it would be Hawaiian Electric in our meter and our bill, or the Board of Water Supply in, again, the water meter itself. So it's very easy, for us as a public enterprise. There's no concerns about privacy in that regard. But when we're talking about benchmarking, there's a lot more that needs to be discussed in terms of the how of the information that is being collected, the precision and accuracy in terms of the frequency and availability, but also how do you ensure that it's in aggregation and not potentially getting too specific about any particular tenant, because it's not about divulging and breaching any of that kind of really important potential private information, and just learning in aggregate the awareness of that building's performance to then drive and think about how we can allocate funds to support any of the transitions, or that building operator can engage with its own tenants. So there are certain elements of a benchmarking policy and program that are different decision points. And those could be the size of buildings that are included. John mentioned in New York City, it's 25,000 square feet and above. That's sort of an open discussion for us here in Honolulu. And even the timing, right? You could do different buildings on the first foray. You could have larger buildings and then, perhaps over time become more inclusive. But it's really the availability of the information, and we might have some additional requests to the utility, potentially even through the PUC, to make that data disaggregation and the availability of the information that much more readily available, so that any building operator or owner could relay that information as ultimately structured by an ordinance. And again, that policy itself doesn't exist yet. We did give a presentation to City Council at the Transportation Sustainability and Health Committee just last week, Tuesday, and they're interested in it. It's important that the city is demonstrating and leading by example, and certainly helps that there are so many that have been proactive over the years. And again, it's what's the least painful way to get information that then makes it helpful to act on information. And that's really the intent around benchmarking, is not just to collect data. You know, we don't necessarily need another reporting obligation, but it's using that and being empowered with that to support market action or government programs to help facilitate and bring resources to those that perhaps aren't in the best position to immediately tap into them.
Great, I appreciate that. That's helpful. Rachel, I'm going to jump over to you. There's a question here that is asking about the Hawaii PUC and how the commission is responding to the needs and the policies to transform Hawaii's energy transition, and I think be more inclusive of LMI communities in recent proceedings.
Yeah, I appreciate this question because it gives me an opportunity to highlight some of the things I think maybe aren't perceived as like particularly ground shaking. So the regulatory process is like super convoluted and it has lots of layers, and commissions are this quasi-judicial body. And so some would say that they really shouldn't be moving policy, but only following policy that has been established. But I'm really thrilled to work for this commission because I feel like, especially in the wake of COVID-19, they've been really responsive in looking to make information more available to community members. And so being able to host things online, having a repository on YouTube of the various hearings that have been held, as well as just public conference and status updates for people who want to tune in and have the time, whether it's live in real time or whether it's later catching it on YouTube, you're able to understand at least some of the things that are in mind for the commission to consider. And in terms of urgency, and particularly in terms of the transition, this commission has been really concerned with making sure after the coal plant is decommissioned in 2022, that there are sufficient renewable energy resources to pick up that, to be able to meet the load. And I see that as just an unwillingness to allow Hawaii to remain a fossil fuel generated, like to remain a state that its energy is provided by fossil fuel generation. And I think that's for the benefit of the people here, but it's also a commitment to, I think, global stewardship. So that's one way for me. I mean, I feel like I could go on and on about it, but those are some small ways in terms of making information more available to public. And then specifically with LMI communities, the community-based renewable energy program, phase 2 has a more specific focus on ensuring that LMI community members are able to access renewable energy opportunities. I could go on. As a lawyer, I could talk endlessly, but I'm sure there's other questions.
Just working for the commission, you could probably go on endlessly, but maybe I'm just biased. I'm really incredibly proud of the commission and my time there. Just think that we've been leading in this energy transition for so long, and it's beautiful to me, and I really respect the leadership that's sitting at the commission right now, staff included. I'm going to pop back over to John. This one's a little long, so bear with me. But someone asked, you mentioned NYC's pending fossil-free building legislation. Similar efforts last year to reduce the carbon footprint of Honolulu's buildings included a ban on natural gas water heaters in new single-family homes. And it was ultimately blocked by construction and natural gas industry lobbyists, I guess under the premise of keeping housing more affordable. And the question is New York City seeing similar opposition? And do you have any suggestions for preventing special interests from derailing decarbonization efforts? So I'll stop there. There's more.
That's a good question. That is a big question. I guess a couple of points I'd make. So what is the legislation that we know today? The legislation as introduced would ban fossil fuels in new construction and major renovation in 2 years after passage. So I'm not sure that's the bill that's the law that will pass eventually, but that's the starting point on what the discussion is all about. It's really being pushed by environmental justice and progressive grassroots advocates. Because there's a really important part here. Two things, as I mentioned. One, it is our #1 problem in New York City. Burning fossil fuels at the building for heat and hot water is our #1 source of carbon emissions. We will never get to our climate goals without tackling this issue. And, kind of new construction, as Matt had even suggested, is a easier way to go than retrofit. And so we're starting small here. And it's a big step, but it's not, existing buildings. For perspective on that, 90% of the buildings we're going to have in New York City in 2050 are the buildings we have today. So when we talk about new construction, it's important, but it really is a small first step to what is going to be required as a larger next step. So that's the first thing. Second thing is what's often missing from this debate is the health co-benefit of doing these actions, particularly in environmental justice communities. Whether it's the boiler itself, look at these boilers are in basements, burning natural gas to create heat and hot water, which is a good thing, right? They're also creating carbon emissions, which has been the whole sole focus of our discussion, which is important. But guess what? They're also emitting NOx, SOx, and PM 2.5 at the building, which contributes to health issues and asthma and lung disease in a time of a a respiratory pandemic is, a really relevant point. So we need to get these buildings off of there, and then we need to get the power plants off of there too, because they're at a larger scale emitting these pollutants in environmental justice neighborhoods as well. So I would say to overcome the obstacle, we have a little bit different hurdle in New York in the sense that this is our #1 problem. So the spotlight is on this to work on it. And secondly, the health lens has been a different and a positive lens by which to talk about these issues in addition to the climate benefits.
Rachel, okay, yeah, Matt, I mean, I'm willing to open it up to all of you because I think each of you probably have something to say on this.
Well, I didn't want to belabor the point, but mostly just wanted to share, thinking back to your opening, Sam, and like the mantras are hugely important. Without sort of like constantly delivering the message of where we intend to go, we'll just lose motivation. But that motivation can waver over time. And I was struck by, and I'm sharing this with all participants in the chat here, a somewhat clickbaity headline in Grist, which is an environmental nonprofit news outlet, talking about Vancouver, which has been on the forefront of stances and commitments and proclamations. And I disagree with the headline of like what went wrong, and it's more about like a reminder of what it takes to make change. There are so many global, local, external, internal forces and challenges, but we can't lose sight of what John is talking about. It's like when you know what the driver or the issue or the thing that you have to do is, you have to just keep finding the ways to work on it. And sometimes they're going to be giant leaps. Sometimes they're going to be push you back on your okole, but what it is knowing where we're going. And that's really the strength of some of these commitments. And I certainly can appreciate folks that are like, oh, when you just say a thing, it feels so ethereal. But if you're not willing to say what you're trying to work on, then you're in a harder position to even know what you're doing anyway. So I'll leave that with the group here. And we're in that same boat. We've made some very big commitments, but we also know we need to do them. And to Rachel's point, we need to figure out how to do them better and not just sort of take the same approach of change for change's sake that has really walked over these islands for the past couple centuries.
Yeah, Rachel, anything to add to that? I mean,
I feel like I could just echo what was shared, but I appreciate Matt kind of reiterating, like acknowledging what has happened and what has gone wrong before. I think one of the things that it's also my personality to kind of defer to like, well, people probably want to do the right thing. And even if it doesn't turn out right, like they probably started with good intentions in mind. And sometimes I think it takes like reminding people of their good intentions because things aren't always easy. And in the face of climate change and urgency, you're asking about equity and you're asking people to look at hard stuff. Like remind people of their good intentions. And I feel that sounds really basic, but to your point of mantras and like people needing to be reminded of kind of where we're heading and why, I think conversations like this that allow us to speak about those things with specificity, hopefully it rings true with people in a way that's like, yeah, you know, I have thought about that. Let me think about that a little more, or make sure that's incorporated in more of my conversations. And I think the fact that equity is a part of this conversation is reflective of what happens when people continue to carry a conversation forward.
Right. Yeah. Don't underestimate the effect of conditioning, everyone. It is real. And so I'm really happy that the mantras piece is sticking out because I wasn't sure how that was going to go over. Let's see here. A couple more questions. We have one for John that's specific to urban green. So the question is, urban green gives important policy guidance. How is urban green staff funded and what is the relationship to policymakers?
Good question. Our relationship to policymakers is we're a policy advocate. And so, you know, we work with our city council, our mayor, our state policymakers, increasingly federal policymakers, to provide our best input. We have some of the most unique data and the analysis that we bring to these debates, and we're known for that. And so that's, we typically lead with the research that we're doing to not to undermine, but to underscore where we need to go, either in a policy that we're trying to propose or to support a policy that the government is trying to do. So we use all of our levers to do that. How are we funded? We're funded in 3 ways. We're funded through memberships and sponsorships. So if any of you have a New York office, get in touch with me. Love to welcome you as a member of Urban Green. That's about a third. About a third comes from foundation support. And then another third comes from earned income from our training and education programs.
Great. Okay, well, we have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to check in with you guys. I have a couple of ideas. I could turn it around. I could turn the poll question around to, can you tell me what a carbon neutral city means or looks like to you? Or if you have burning questions for one another, can allow that to take place too. So any preference? If I'm going to,
you're in charge. It's
okay. Yeah,
it's your burden.
I'm inclined to hear the feedback from the participants on the poll.
So why don't we just, let's turn it around. Why don't you guys just give a quick 1 minute response to the poll question of what a carbon neutral city means to you?
I don't think I need a minute, but I'm going to keep it pretty quantitative here. I mean, if we are really talking about this, we need to be able to set up the systems to track, measure, and report. And certainly that carbon neutral, right, opens the door to ideas about nature-based systems and their ability to help us along the plight. But we need to, I think the cleanest way to clean carbon neutral is to really make sure that we are as carbon minimal as possible in the direct sources that we are able to measure, because some of those other systems are getting harder to measure, and we're actually seeing the challenges of those systems to survive because of climate changes that we're seeing.
Yeah, I have a super basic. I mean, like carbon neutral is carbon neutral. Like, I mean, I'm just like, there's a balance there. And I'll take this moment to briefly respond to a question in the chat and speaking about like, how do you deal with this nuance in terms of energy justice and like when you're engaging with community and like harms versus like it's a little bit better environmentally, even if a community doesn't want that. I think really having a conversation and not just a like point in time, we're going to ask this community once, but like committing to consistently engage and really be a community member as an organization, I think is the key to help working through some of that nuance and really figuring out what that middle way is. I realize it doesn't totally just get at the carbon neutral component, but I think carbon neutral cities, outside of the mathematical computation of what that is, they look like thriving communities where people have an understanding, ownership, and engagement and what their community really looks like.
Yeah, I see it as a wide transformation too, Rachel. So points well taken.
I would see it as, cities are going to have to reduce by 2050, cities are going to have to reduce carbon emissions 80, 85, 90%, and whatever else is being emitted is going to have to be captured out of the air and sequestered to reach that neutrality.
Well, great. We have about a minute left. So there you have it, everyone. I hope these panelists inspired you to get creative in the ways that you are approaching helping your city, place, town, and community commit to a more sustainable and decarbonized way of life. And I hope you will join us all for our next panel discussion. If you've registered for our next session, you'll find the link in the chat, or it will have been sent to you, and we'll see you here shortly. Thank you so much, Rachel, John, and Matthew, for your time. Really insightful perspectives across the board.
Great to be with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Aloha.
Thank you for having us. Aloha.
Aloha.